Hi, and welcome to Crash Course Catholicism, a podcast about Catholic teaching and why it makes sense. I'm your host, Caitlin West. Hi friends, welcome to this episode on the life of Mother Teresa. Okay, so why are we doing an episode on Mother Teresa? Well, because we have just concluded a deep dive into the first section of the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Catholic Church. And one of the things that came up during that deep dive over and over again is the fact that Catholic social doctrine is deeply rooted in the dignity of the human person. That's really at the center of social doctrine. So Mother Teresa is the saint who perhaps understood and lived out this understanding better than just about anyone in the whole of the 20th century. Every aspect of Mother Teresa's life and work reflects her understanding of the dignity of every human person and her desire to honor that dignity, even in the poorest and most marginalized people in the world. So when Mother Teresa won the Nobel Peace Prize, she said the following in her acceptance speech. She said, "We are wanting to proclaim the good news to the poor that God loves them, that we love them, that they are somebody to us, that they too have been created by the same loving hand of God to love and to be loved. Our poor people are great people, are very lovable people. They don't need our pity and sympathy. They need our understanding love. They need respect. They need that we treat them with dignity. And I think this is the greatest poverty that we experience." And that's such a powerful idea, that the greatest form of human poverty isn't material poverty. It's that poverty of being deprived of your human dignity and deprived of that awareness and knowledge of the fact that you are a loved child of God, that you mean something, that you matter in the world. So this is the message that Mother Teresa spent her life spreading. And it's kind of a call to each one of us as well to honor the dignity of every human person, no matter how different they are from us, no matter how poor they are, no matter what their abilities are, etc. So in this episode, we're going to go through a kind of brief biography of Mother Teresa, and then we're going to think about what it was that made her such an amazing saint. There are a few key pillars that we're going to look at of her sanctity, and we're going to go through each one of them and understand what was it that made Mother Teresa such an incredible saint, but also how we can apply each of those things to our own lives as well. But first, let's start with a biography of Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa was born Agnes Gonje in what is now North Macedonia in the year 1910. She was the youngest of 3 children, and her father died when she was 8 years old. Agnes was born into a Catholic family, and from a young age, she was fascinated and moved by stories not just of the saints, but specifically stories of missionaries. And this is when the first kind of seeds of her vocation took root in her childhood. At the age of 12, she became convinced that God was calling her to dedicate herself completely to Him in the religious life. And at the age of 18, she left her home and moved to Ireland to join the Sisters of Loreto. Now, sadly, this was actually the last time she would ever see her mother or her sister ever again. And there were a few reasons for that. One was just because of the distance, also because of the demands of her vocation. But one significant reason why she was never able to see her family again was because her home country was under communist rule at the time. So on several occasions later in her life, Mother Teresa requested permission to return home to visit because her mother was unwell and nearing the end of her life, but her requests were denied by the communist authorities in Albania because they suspected that she was an agent of the Vatican. So Mother Teresa never saw her mother or her sister again, and this separation obviously caused her profound suffering. In 1928, she joined the Sisters of Loreto and took the name Teresa in honor of Saint Therese of Lisieux. And in 1929, she moved to India to live out her vocation there. So the Sisters of Loreto, which she originally joined, were dedicated to education. So Sister Teresa began her novitiate teaching at a school called St. Teresa's in Darjeeling, before later moving to another school in Calcutta. Now, Sister Teresa served as a teacher and eventually a headmistress of this Calcutta school for nearly 20 years. And during that time, she witnessed the immense poverty in the streets and the slums of Calcutta. And this was an experience that deeply affected her. In 1946, at the age of 36, she was on a train traveling to Darjeeling for her yearly retreat. And on that train trip, she suddenly experienced what she later referred to as a call within a call. She said that she heard God telling her that she needed to leave the Sisters of Loreto and serve the poor in Calcutta. And she later wrote the following. She said, "I was to leave the convent and help the poor while living among them. It was an order. To fail would have been to break the faith." So Mother Teresa was absolutely convinced of this call from God. And one thing that really stands out when you read her writings, so there's a book called Come Be My Light, which contains many of her personal writings. It's a beautiful book and I recommend reading it. When you read that book, it becomes very clear that this wasn't just a kind of whim, right? This wasn't just her suddenly deciding to throw off her vows as a Sister of Loreto and just strike out on her own. It actually was the culmination of 20 years of developing a profound and deep relationship with God that was rooted in prayer and the sacraments. It was as though God had been preparing her for this calling for her whole life. Okay, so as soon as Sister Teresa realized what was being asked of her by God, she acted straight away. And this is something that becomes clear when you read about her, that she was like a woman of action. When she knew that God wanted something, she just went for it. So she immediately requested permission to be released from her vows and to begin living and working amongst the poor in Calcutta. Now, because at that point she remained bound by her vows, this wasn't a decision that she could just make independently, right? It required careful discernment by her superiors, by her bishop, and approval through the appropriate church channels. So she had to go through this whole process, and the bishop really needed to discern this calling that she had received. And that took time, which is appropriate, right? It's good that it took that time, and it's good that the bishop was prudent. But that caused Mother Teresa a lot of suffering because she had to wait for 2 years, even though she knew what God wanted. And this is one of the things that comes through in Come Be My Light. You get a sense of her impatience, that she's writing these letters to the bishop, begging him to just move the process along and being please just let me begin my work. And this wasn't just her being kind of impatient in a sort of worldly human way. It was a holy urgency that was rooted in this conviction that she knew what God was asking of her. She'd heard his call clearly, and she was suffering until she could fulfill that call. And actually, this sense of urgency makes particular sense when we put it in the context of a vow that she had made a few years earlier. So Mother Teresa in the 1940s made a private vow to God to give him anything he might ask for and to never refuse him even the smallest thing. So in that context, you can understand why she suffered a lot in those 2 years where she was waiting for permission to go and begin the work that God was asking her to do. So in the year 1948, about 2 years after she'd first heard that calling, Mother Teresa was finally able to begin her work with the poor in Calcutta. So she left the convent, she went and received some basic medical training, and she went straight into the slums and started doing what she could to help people. So this is how the author and journalist Malcolm Muggeridge puts it. He says, "When at last her release came, she stepped out with a few rupees in her pocket, made her way to the poorest, wretchedest quarter of the city, found a lodging there, gathered together a few abandoned children, and began her ministry of love." So Mother Teresa had no resources, she had no money, she had no help, she had to beg for every single thing that she needed. She was really taking seriously this calling to live among the poor and to live like them. Very quickly, though, she began to gather followers around her, and eventually the local authorities gave her a hostel that she was able to use, and at that point she was able to officially found her order, which she called the Missionaries of Charity. She and the other sisters wore white saris as their habits with blue stripes on them, and there were 3 blue stripes to represent their vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The order was officially approved as a religious institute by the Vatican in 1950, which was just a couple of years after Mother Teresa first began her work in Calcutta. And then in 1965, it was elevated to the status of a pontifical congregation. So that just means that instead of reporting directly to the local bishop, they reported to the Pope. And that change was really helpful because it allowed the Missionaries of Charity more independence, and it made it easier for them to establish communities internationally. Over time, the Missionaries of Charity founded schools, medical dispensaries, hospices for the dying, centres for people with disabilities, and homes for the blind and the elderly in countries all around the world. Mother Teresa's work quickly gained international recognition. In 1969, the British journalist Malcolm Muggeridge made a BBC documentary called Something Beautiful for God, and this documentary introduced her work in Calcutta to a global audience, and it played a really important role in raising awareness of her mission around the world. Malcolm Muggeridge also eventually wrote a book about Mother Teresa called also Something Beautiful for God, and that book is extremely worth reading. It's very readable and really beautiful. So, Mother Teresa eventually received numerous awards, most notably the Nobel Peace Prize in 1979, and she was invited to speak internationally in front of presidents and royalty. She was widely respected by public figures, including Pope John Paul II and Princess Diana, with both of whom she maintained close and supportive relationships. Mother Teresa continued her work for nearly 40 years, and eventually she died of heart failure in the year 1997 at the age of 87. Very soon after her death, her cause for canonization was opened. She was beatified in 2003 and canonized in 2016, less than 20 years after her death. Now, we've said that Mother Teresa gained international recognition. She had a huge impact on the world. She was one of those kind of giants of the 20th century alongside people like St. John Paul II. And here's a really important question. Why is that the case? Why was Mother Teresa such a big deal? Why did she have such an impact on the world? And you might hear that and think, well, I mean, it's obvious, right? Like, she was amazing. She was doing amazing things. She was helping the poorest of the poor. She was living in the slums and, looking after people who were sick and dying. Like, she was amazing. And it's like, yeah, of course, like, she was. But if we think about it, there's more to it than that. Because first of all, there are plenty of people out there who are philanthropists, and there are plenty of people out there who are humanitarians, who give their time and their money and even their lives for people in need. Another thing that's important to note is that Mother Teresa didn't just kind of go around smiling sweetly and telling people what they wanted to hear. Mother Teresa was very outspoken. She had no problem speaking out on topics including not just poverty and human dignity, but also abortion and euthanasia. She would get up in front of presidents and denounce abortion. So in one sense, she was kind of a contentious figure. So why did she attract such love and adoration? Well, the simple answer to that question is that Mother Teresa had an impact because she was a great saint. Her holiness was remarkable. She made such an impression on people because she was like Christ. So this is the way that Malcolm Muggeridge puts it. He says, "I never met anyone more memorable. Just meeting her for a fleeting moment makes an ineffaceable impression. I have known people burst into tears when she goes, though it was only from a tea party where their acquaintance with her amounted to no more than receiving her smile. Once, I had occasion to see her off with one of the sisters at Calcutta railway station. When the train began to move and I walked away, I felt as though I were leaving behind me all the beauty and all the joy in the universe. Something of God's universal love has rubbed off on Mother Teresa, giving her homely features a noticeable luminosity, a shining quality. She has lived so closely with her Lord that the same enchantment clings about her that sent the crowds chasing after him in Jerusalem and Galilee and made his mere presence seem a harbinger of healing. So those are pretty strong words from Malcolm Muggeridge, and we have to bear in mind that at this point, Muggeridge was not a Catholic. He was actually quite skeptical of the Catholic Church. He did eventually convert. But he recognized that Mother Teresa was amazing because she was so close to our Lord that she had become like him. It's like St. Paul says, "It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me." Christ lived in Mother Teresa. Now, as I was preparing this episode, there were 5 different aspects of her sanctity, or like pillars of her sanctity, that really stood out to me. So I think it's worth going through each of those and thinking about how we can apply each of them to our own life. So the first of these pillars is prayer. Mother Teresa prayed. She started every day by waking up at 4:30 a.m. and doing 2 hours of prayer in front of the Blessed Sacrament before Mass. Prayer was at the center of Mother Teresa's life. And that's really important because her life was full of a lot of activity. She did a lot of things. It would have been very easy for her to get up and be like, no, I need to just start immediately going out and like helping the poor and doing things because people need my help. But Mother Teresa understood that the kind of fuel for her to be effective wasn't her own action. It was the grace of God, and she needed to rely on that grace. So every day she spent that time in prayer. And this is what Mother Teresa said about prayer. She said, "Every moment of prayer, especially before our Lord in the tabernacle, is a sure positive gain. The time we spend in having our daily audience with God is the most precious part of the whole day." Now, we might hear that and think, well, that's lovely that Mother Teresa got up at 4:30 in the morning and did 2 hours of prayer, but that's not something that I can really do in my life. And that is true. Most of us are not called to get up at 4:30 in the morning and pray for 2 hours. However, all of us can pray. Like maybe it's for 15 minutes, maybe it's for 5 minutes, maybe it's for half an hour. We can spend some time in prayer with God every day. I remember hearing a priest say once, he was like, when I hear people say, I don't have time to pray, he's like, I wonder if if anyone ever says, I don't have time to eat meals, or I don't have time to drink water, or I don't have time to exercise. It's like, or I don't have time to sleep. Like, well, there are certain things that you just need in life and you have to make time for. And prayer is just as essential to the spiritual life as food and drink and rest are to the physical life. And even throughout the day, we can continue to incorporate prayer into our lives. So this is another quote from Mother Teresa. She said, "You can pray while you work. Work doesn't stop prayer, and prayer doesn't stop work. It requires only that small raising of the mind to Him. I love you, God. I trust you. I believe in you. I need you now." Small things like that. They are wonderful prayers. So we can all put aside some time in our day to pray to God, and we can also incorporate prayer into our daily lives. Okay, and then the second pillar was the Eucharist. Mother Teresa once wrote the following about the Eucharist. She said, "The attraction for the Blessed Sacrament at times was so great, I longed for Holy Communion. Night after night, sleep would disappear, only to spend those hours in longing for His coming." So Mother Teresa longed for the Eucharist so much that she couldn't even sleep at night. The Eucharist and the Holy Mass, along with prayer, sat right at the center of our life. And she didn't just love our Lord in the Eucharist, she relied on Him. She understood that at the end of the day, she could do nothing without Him. So at one point she wrote the following to her Archbishop. She said, "If we have our Lord in the midst of us with daily Mass and Holy Communion, I fear nothing for the sisters, nor myself. He will look after us. But without Him, I cannot be. I am helpless." So Mother Teresa prayed, and she relied on the Eucharist to strengthen and support her. The third pillar is joy and cheerfulness. Mother Teresa and her sisters lived a really tough life, but despite that, they all radiated joy. So Malcolm Muggeridge writes, "Their life is tough and austere by worldly standards, yet I never met such delightful, happy women or such an atmosphere of joy as they create." So Mother Teresa consciously placed joy and cheerfulness at the center of her life. It's very easy to find quotes from Mother Teresa about the importance of smiling at people. She was always encouraging people to try to be cheerful and to try to smile. I remember once years ago, I was at a retreat and I was reading a book about Mother Teresa, and I cannot remember what the book was, but it was like a biography of her. And in the book, it said that she once went on a silent retreat, and at the end of her retreat, she only made one resolution, and that resolution was to smile at God. And this is one of the incredible things that kind of came through with her, which was her cheerfulness. She had this incredible, radiant smile. In fact, her joy was so noticeable and so striking that people were shocked to discover after her death how much Mother Teresa had actually suffered. And this leads us to the next pillar, the fourth pillar, which is suffering. Mother Teresa suffered. And it's not just that she had a hard life by worldly standards. I mean, she did. She lived a life of total poverty and discomfort, and that was obviously difficult. But even more than that, Mother Teresa experienced intense spiritual suffering for much of her adult life. So soon after she received her call within a call in 1946, Mother Teresa began to experience a deep and persistent sense of spiritual emptiness. She described feelings of emotional and spiritual dryness, an absence of the sense of God's presence in her prayer, and a profound sense of separation from God. Now, this experience wasn't a loss of faith. It's not that she didn't believe in God. It's that there was an absence of the kind of emotional consolations and those feelings of closeness to God that she had previously experienced. Now, this experience of that inner suffering, that feeling of being cut off from God, continued in sort of varying degrees of intensity for the rest of her life, roughly 50 years. Now, the concept of the dark night of the soul is one that often is used in Catholic spirituality to describe periods of like deep spiritual desolation experienced by the saints. And it's often understood as a form of purification through which that saint is drawn into a deeper union with God through their sharing in the suffering of Christ on the cross. It's almost like they're experiencing with Christ that moment on the cross where he calls out, my God, why have you abandoned me?" Now, in Mother Teresa's case, that experience of the dark night of the soul lasted for far longer than is typical in the lives of many of the saints. But she kind of interpreted it as a way of allowing her to suffer for the sake of the poor, and also to live a kind of solidarity with them, to experience the feeling of abandonment that they felt, and to be able to offer that feeling of abandonment and suffering for their sake. Now, it's really interesting because we've just said that one of the pillars of her sanctity is this joy and cheerfulness. And we've also said that suffering was the other pillar. And it seems like a paradox, but actually Mother Teresa perfectly captures this reality, this truth that we find in Catholicism, which is that joy comes not in the absence of suffering, but through suffering. Through suffering, we arrive at joy. And it feels so paradoxical, but it is 100% true, and it's exemplified by the lives of all of the saints, and in particular, Mother Teresa. She suffered immeasurably, but through that suffering, she was also one of the most genuinely joyful and cheerful people on earth. And we can go back to Malcolm Muggeridge saying that when she walked away from him, it was like all of the joy had gone out of the world because she was carrying it with her. And then the final pillar, the fifth pillar that we're going to talk about, is self-giving. Mother Teresa lived her whole life as a gift of self. Right from that moment when she was 12 years old and she decided she was going to give herself to God completely, right up until her death at the age of 87. So this is something that Bishop Barron talks about that I found really useful. He talks about how often when we think about joy and how to become happy, we think, okay, well, what are the areas in my life that are lacking? And then how can I fill up those areas? So I have a lack of money or power or friends or esteem, and I need to fill that lack. And I'm not going to be happy until I get the thing that I'm missing. But actually what Mother Teresa exemplifies is that it's actually the opposite. The way to become happy is by turning your life into a gift, is by giving yourself to others. And this is something that Malcolm Muggeridge points out about Mother Teresa as well. He says, there is much talk today about discovering an identity as though it was something to be looked for, then once found to be hoarded and treasured. Actually, the more it is spent, the richer it becomes. So with Mother Teresa, in effacing herself, she becomes herself. So what Muggeridge is basically pointing out here is that often we kind of assume that the more you're giving yourself to other people, the less you are yourself, the more you're losing yourself. But actually what Mother Teresa really exemplified was the more you give yourself, the more you become yourself. Okay, now before we finish this episode, it's worth touching on some of the controversies around Mother Teresa, because it kind of became a bit fashionable in like the noughties to criticize Mother Teresa, people like Christopher Hitchens. And the criticisms often revolved around a couple of things. First of all, that Mother Teresa wasn't really doing much by human standards. So she wasn't actually solving world poverty. She wasn't curing illness. She wasn't saving people. She was just kind of like, cleaning their wounds and being loving to them. And then the second criticism is kind of an extension of this, which is that she was basically glorifying suffering. She was sort of allowing people to wallow in their suffering rather than alleviating that suffering. Okay, so to address that first controversy, that she actually wasn't doing much by human standards, well, this is how Malcolm Muggeridge responds to that criticism in his book. He says, "It is perfectly true that statistically speaking, what she achieves is little or even negligible. But then Christianity is not a statistical view of life. Mother Teresa is fond of saying that welfare is for a purpose, an admirable and a necessary one, whereas Christian love is for a person." So basically what he's saying is that, yes, it's true, by human standards, technically Mother Teresa wasn't doing much. But then that wasn't her aim. She wasn't trying to solve world hunger or alleviate all physical suffering. Her aim was to come face to face with the individual person who is suffering, being Christ to them, showing them that they are loved and that they have dignity. So it wasn't so much about curing illness, although of course they also, cleaned people's wounds and provided them with medicine and did everything they could. But the main purpose was to treat the poor and the suffering with love and dignity. And then this leads to that second criticism, which is that she was basically glorifying suffering. Well, Mother Teresa's work can only really, truly be understood in the context of a Catholic understanding of suffering. The Catholic Church sees suffering as a path to holiness, as redemptive, right? And so again, Mother Teresa's number one aim wasn't to alleviate suffering, although of course wherever she could, she would alleviate suffering. But her number one aim was to help people discover Christ and discover their own dignity in that suffering. So it wasn't that she was trying to prolong people's suffering or not alleviate it when she could, but it was that she was trying to kind of, in that place of suffering, help that person discover joy and experience love. And I read one quote from her, I'm paraphrasing now, but it was something along the lines of, "It's true that the work that we are doing is just a drop in the ocean, but without that one drop, the ocean would be lacking something." I love that image. It's and I think that's something that we can apply to all of us. That, okay, maybe I feel like I'm not doing much in the world. Maybe I'm just doing a 9-to-5 job and I don't feel like I'm doing much. But through, if we live these same pillars of Mother Teresa, prayer, the Eucharist, joy and cheerfulness, living suffering well and giving ourselves to others, we can be that little drop in the ocean. And without our little drop in the ocean, then the ocean would be lacking something. God is calling each and every one of us to sanctity, to do what we can, not just to grow holier and to grow closer to Him, but also to bring that light of Christ to the world, to help others see their worth and to see that they are loved by Christ in the way that we interact with them, by becoming Christ and then being Christ to others in the world. Okay. Great. Well, that's all we have time for today. In our bonus content for this episode, we are going to go through some of the writings of Mother Teresa, because honestly, you could just sit and read her writings and quotes from her forever and ever and just take so much from it, because she has such spiritually rich reflections. So we're going to go through some of her writings in our bonus content. Okay, great. Well, thank you for sticking with me. In our next episode, we're going to begin our next deep dive. I'm so excited. I can't wait. Have Have a fantastic fortnight, and I will talk to you later. Okay, bye. Hey friends, thanks for listening to this episode. If you are enjoying the podcast and you would like to see it continue and reach many more people, then I invite you to consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the show notes of this episode. There are many running costs associated with running a podcast, and I rely 100% on the generosity of patrons. Thank you so much to those who already support the podcast. And most importantly, please continue to pray for me and for all of those who are listening. Okay, bye.